Hello and welcome back to the Patient First Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Bryan Laskin, and I'm very excited to be with you here today. And I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics, myself. Just kidding. Well, sort of. I'm going to talk about myself a lot this episode. But why is that? Well, as I talk about on this podcast quite a bit, is I love having coaches. And I have had just some phenomenal coaches through my entire career. And I believe in always having at least one coach. And for about the last year, I have had a new coach, Lee, who's just been phenomenal. And he brought something to my attention last week that I wanted to talk a little bit on this podcast. It feels like it's a little off topic, but I'll bring it back to how dentists and patients work together. And if you're a dentist, I think this might be a little eye-opening into the options into dentistry. And if you're a patient, into some areas of dentistry that you may not have thought about before. But what Lee talked about was something called XQ. Now, the reason why I want to bring this up is that a lot of people know about IQ. Obviously, it's your intelligence quotient. And then there's been a lot of talk about EQ in the workplace today, which is vitally important. I think that is one of the superpowers that going forward, if you're going to be a leader, if you're going to be leading or managing people, having emotional intelligence so that you can lead people empathetically or compassionately, probably more accurately, to get things accomplished, I think is increasingly important. You know, you can think about it as the difference between sort of the, Henry Ford era where it was just like a big hierarchy to now actually working with younger people today that life-work balance is much more important. Things like sustainability is a bigger issue. So there's a bigger emotional component to everything that we do in business. And the next big frontier that people are going to be talking about is XQ that Lee brought up. And I think this was very interesting. It's called the Experience Quotient, meaning what experiences are you bringing to the table? And maybe it's because I have a little more gray in my beard that experience actually, I've been thinking a lot about that since this was brought up to me. And so I wanted to talk a little about experience, how that comes into play into just life in general, but also into dentistry, because, if you talk about the experience quotient just from the pure experience of being at the dentist. So as a dentist or a patient, we obviously have very different experiences that we bring into our perspective. And that's frankly what my first book, The Patient First Manifesto, is all about. It was really, when I think about this XQ, it's the XQ of a dental patient, the XQ of a dentist or a dental professional more accurately, because if you're a hygienist, dental assistant, you work at the business team of a dental practice. We have very different experiences that we're bringing to the table. And that's what the Patient First Manifesto is all about, and how to bridge what I call the great disconnect, which is the XQ difference between patients and dental professionals. Now, I've got to talk for about 140 pages about it. So I won't go too deep into it here, but you can get a copy of the book. We'll put a link around this presentation, or you can go to upgradedental.com and I'm sure you can get a version there. But so XQ is incredibly important when it comes to the patient-dentist relationship. But I also want to talk a little bit about my experience, because it's relevant to where we're going on this podcast and kind of what I'm working on now. So number one, I am a dentist. I graduated from dental school in the year 1999, being in Minnesota. It's a very relevant year for Prince, right? 99. And I actually was at Prince's Paisley Park on New Year's Eve, 1999. Another talk show, but it was a great experience. But through the course of literally 20 years, almost, because I graduated, I guess, in May of 1999, and I sold my practices basically at the very, very end of the year in 2019. So like basically December 31st, 2000. So I'm rounding it to 20 years total. But through the course of that 20 years, I bought and sold 6 practices. I worked with over a dozen dentists, hundreds of amazing team members, 10,000 patients or more. And when I did sell my practices in late 2018, 2019, I joined the leadership team of the group that I sold to for a few years, where I learned a lot, including that I don't really do well in a traditional corporation. As somebody who is a change catalyst and loves innovation, I realized that innovation doesn't happen through one person. It has to be through a culture of people, which again, we'll be talking about culture and an innovative culture in another podcast coming up soon. But I just wanted to mention that over 20 years, I did have a lot of experience doing clinical dentistry. Through these 20 years, most of the very vast majority of these years, except for the last 3 years, I worked 5 days a week seeing patients. So that's important when I get to the next slide, but I saw a lot of patients and did a lot of clinical dentistry for a very long time. And then overlapping with that, from 2012 to 2021, I started and joined 9 different dental software companies. So 3 I started myself, Opera DDS, Opera VR, now called Digital Nitrous, and Dental TNT. Dental TNT was shut down before we really even got to selling anything because we realized that that was a product that people weren't really interested in. And then I joined 6 more, 2 of which have shut down and 4 that are still going on right now. The biggest of which the first one I started, Opera DDS, I sold to Vine Dental about 2 years ago. And it was a great, huge success story. And you know, what's really pertinent here is that for about 5 substantive years, I was working full-time as a dentist and then also building software companies. And a lot of times I was the only team member or one of 2 or 3 team members at the software company. So my main point to anybody listening to this is never do that. I worked way too hard. It just didn't make sense to be working basically 2 full-time jobs. And so since then I've been able to focus obviously more on software, and that's really software and education, like this wonderful podcast here. And so during that time though, I had a lot of different experiences, and I've worked with, during this time too, also worked with at least a dozen manufacturers on different councils for education, innovation, and worked with a lot of different dental manufacturers and distributors, working for them and with them, and just learned a whole ton, a whole side of the industry that as a patient you would never think about, and as a dentist maybe you haven't even thought too much about what goes on into making the adhesives, you know, talking to the engineers who make the adhesives, or the marketing people at a large distributor company and how they're challenged in getting dentists to change their mindsets. That's what really went on in this whole area. As I came to understand sort of the dentist perspective from the software side, because when you take a step back and then you're talking about technology to dentists, you see their perspective and how that differs from the patient's perspective, which is of course what led to the first book. Then when I sold Opera DDS, I've really focused on 3 major initiatives: Upgrade Dental, like this podcast right here, the book that I talked about, and my next book, which I'll talk about in a little bit, Dental Standards Institute, which is trying to change the industry by doing standard development to align the profession so that we can remove the barriers to innovation and also advocate for patients. So if you want to get involved with truly changing the industry, making innovation happen for real in dentistry, and or advocating for dental patients, let me know if you want to be involved with DSI. And then Tooth Apps, which is the interoperability platform that we've just recently launched. Just super excited about Tooth Apps and what we're doing there to bring great innovation, really implementing the tools so that people can break out of the data prisons that they're in. Patients who legally own their data have access to it, and dentists have access to the data that they need to provide the best care. So I'm also working with several new startup companies in the technology space, just because that's kind of an area that I've been working with for about the last decade. And so I've been seeing quite a few things from these different perspectives. This XQ that I've had has led me to really focus on seeing things from the different perspectives, from a patient's perspective, obviously from a dentist perspective, from team members, from manufacturers and distributors and consultants and technology companies within the industry, as investors in the industry and like PE groups. And that's led me to come to some conclusions that I'm going to be talking about in my next book, dentaldisorder.com. So Dental Disorder is the next book that we're going to be releasing here in a few months. You can get on the wait list to get a book for free if you go to dentaldisorder.com, where we're going to continue the story of the XQ that I've had, which is really unveiled some unique parts of the industry that other people don't get to see. These different experiences that I've had, the XQ that I've picked up along the way, has really had me see corners of the industry that many people don't get to be part of, or certainly not get to be part of all of these different areas of the industry. And that's given me a relatively unique perspective to see problems that I see in the industry. And of course, the first book describes the first set of perspective shifts that I've gained from these different experiences, the Patient First Manifesto, where we're talking about the great disconnect between dentists and dental patients. In my next book, Dental Disorder, it's going to be the disconnect between what's going on in the industry and how that hampers care, how we can, and how to fix it, right? What's going on, the biggest problem, I like to say that we're exposing the biggest problem in dentistry and how to solve it, which I believe to be true, that there are some significant barriers in why we can't provide the best quality care, and there's relatively easy solutions. So if you want to learn more, go to dentaldisorder.com. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you right here next week on the Patient First Podcast.